All the details of Fuji's newest top-end APS-C camera have leaked. The X-T4, $1,700 powerhouse that brings like everything you want. IBIS, bigger battery, 4K 60. Let's go over the details and talk about what are still some pretty huge weaknesses in Fuji's lineup. First, I want to thank our sponsor, KEH. If you want a great deal on used gear, or you just want to sell all your old gear that you're not using and get quick money for it, head to sdp.io/KEH14. I just saw this article in Petapixel about how a guy got his camera literally stolen by selling it through a legitimate path, but directly to a consumer. This happened to us too. It happens to people all the time. That's why I really prefer to sell stuff to KEH. There's just no risk with it. Fuji's officially launching the X-T4 in just a few hours, but all of the information is out thanks to Fuji Rumors and Nokashita. Thanks guys for giving us the information. First, a bit of history. The Fujifilm X-T3 has been my favorite camera to actually shoot with since it was released. It has the best user experience with all these beautiful analog dials. It's also very functional. It's the best all-purpose APS-C camera. It has a really fast DVF when it's in sports mode with the shortest lag we've measured on any camera, including like the Sony A9, very high-end sports camera. For a mirrorless camera under $2,000, it was the best sports camera that we found as far as tracking subjects and shooting at a high frames per second. It's been wonderful, and we've been recommending it often. And this is the next version of the X-T3, and it is bigger and better, and it addresses almost all of our concerns about the X-T3. One of the most important is the bigger battery. While shooting stills with the X-T3 didn't become a big problem, when I started trying to use the X-T3 for video, the battery frequently just quickly ran out. They have cranked up the milliamp hours from 1260 to 1235, which should just give you almost twice as much more life to it, which means you won't have to worry about recharging it. You should be able to get through a full day of charging and just plug it in every night like you do your phone. The sensor stabilization is something we've been asking for. Fujifilm had sensor stabilization in their popular X-H1 camera, but the unit was deemed too big and too heavy to put into the smaller X-T3 body, so Fujifilm sort of reinvented the wheel, switched to a magnetic system that allowed them to stabilize the sensor in a smaller body, thus giving us a full 6.5 stops of claimed image stabilization. That's something we're going to have to test. So subscribe, and when the camera is released, we will have a full test for you, and we will give away an X-T4. So be sure to subscribe and possibly win that X-T4. Sony only claims 5.5 stops of image stabilization, so 6.5 stops is a big deal. That means you could go from shooting at 1/90th of a second to 1 full second. That means if you were shooting at the end of your 50 to 140 telephoto lens hand holding, you could technically hand hold that at half a second. Some of those benefits carry over into the video too. Of course, stabilization of the sensor can improve video stabilization, so your handheld video is going to look better. Fuji's also adding digital image stabilization to their video like Canon, which basically means instead of having to stabilize it electronically in post, you can do that in camera. And I like the results. Technically, it's exactly the same as doing it in post, but it's a lot easier to do it in camera because that's very computationally intensive to do that in post. Fuji also added an IS mode boost, which will simulate working on a tripod even though you're handheld. So they will attempt to cancel all motion instead of giving you sort of free-flowing motion. This just adds to its versatility as a video camera. Fuji's also adding 240 frames per second at full HD. So at 30 frames per second, you could do 8 times slow motion, or at 24 frames per second, that's 10 times slow motion. They had to make the body bigger, but it's hardly noticeable, hardly noticeable. If I flip between the two images here of the X-T3 and the X-T4, you can see the body has a tiny bit more width, about 2 millimeters more, and most of that is put into the grip. I always wanted the X-T3 to have a bigger grip, so I consider this only good news. It is about 0.15 of a pound heavier, about 67 grams. There's no room for IBIS or a big battery. I think that's what everybody said when I asked for that on the X-T3. We asked for it, Fuji gave it to us. Thank you. Fuji says the autofocus is better, but that's the kind of thing we'll really have to compare the full production model against other cameras. I'm confident that they did improve it. You can just put a faster processor in there and you'll get better results. But this is really key because when the Fuji X-T3 was launched, the autofocus system was among the best. But since then, Canon and Sony and even Nikon have released new firmware updates that greatly improved their autofocus systems. I'm hoping that the X-T4 will leapfrog those cameras and make it leading edge once again. Perhaps the biggest, most controversial change is that Fuji added a flip screen to the X-T3. So now you'll be able to flip it forward and, you know, take selfies and vlog. At least that's what everybody seems to imagine. The X-T3 had a screen that tilted out and then also tilted to the side to allow for vertical compositions. And that provides a lot of versatility, but it does not allow you to see yourself. Some of the actual reactions from Fuji Rumors commenters. Because of that flippy screen, it's a no instant buy for me. Waiting for the XH2 or the X-T5. I have bad news for you. Both the XH2 and the X-T5 will have a flippy screen. I use the flip screen on my X-T3 a lot for candid photos. It looks like the X-T4 is more of a vlogger selfie camera, so it's not an interesting camera for me. I don't get this argument at all. Just because you can use it for vlogging and selfies doesn't mean that's the only thing it's good for. Flip screen really doesn't impact negatively your use of the camera. I feel like people do not realize how important it is for photographers that you can quickly and easily flip the screen up, down, and still hold the camera with both hands. Let's talk about holding the camera with both hands. When I'm shooting with the camera normally, I always have my left hand on the lens and my right hand on the grip. If I flip the screen out, I still use that exact same configuration. So the flip screen doesn't change how I hold the camera. They also talk about it increasing the width of the camera, and that's true, and that's never been a problem for me. I frequently shoot at press events where it's extremely crowded, and it just so happens that my shoulders are wider than the camera, so it's just never been an issue. Someone can slam on the flip screen so hard that it breaks. I have never broken a flip screen. In fact, to me, if you compare this EOS RP, which is a $950 camera, against the tilt screen on the X-T3, the RP screen feels much more solidly connected, and Fuji's flip screens are really well made, and I've never heard a complaint that they broke. Either way, it's too late. Fuji is putting a flip screen in the X-T4, so here's how you can live with it. First, ask yourself, will you use a flip screen just once in the many years that you might own the camera? Is there just one time when you might want to take a family photo or a straight up selfie to remember yourself, your friends, and where you went? These are great, and you would no longer have to just rely on a crappy smartphone selfie. You could get real quality images. You might take artistic self-portraits. This is an important genre and a way for people to express themselves. But it's also a useful training tool for people who want more experience with lighting and posing and don't want to go through the trouble of hiring a model. Chelsea had an excellent video on this. When I'm filming somebody else, I will frequently flip the screen forward so that the subject of my video can see how much of their body is shown in the frame so they know how to use their arms and how much room they have to move their body. They can also check the composition. If I'm shooting a model, for example, I can review the pictures here, and instead of having them walk all the way around the camera to see it, I can just flip it forward and show them what the pictures look like. This adds a lot of versatility besides just vlogging and selfies. You can flip the screen and completely hide it, thus giving you more of an analog experience. This also protects the screen because the back screen can get scratched up when you put it in and out of your bag. It actually makes the camera more durable. They've improved the resolution of the rear screen, bumping it from 1.04 million dots to 1.62 million dots. That's a weird metric, million dots, because we don't measure our monitors in million dots. When you talk about a dot, you have to realize every dot is red, blue, and green. Like those are three separate dots. Whereas if you talk about the resolution of a 1920 by 1080 monitor like this, every one of those 1920 horizontal dots is 3 red, blue, and green pixels. So 1.62 million dots is only increasing the resolution of the rear screen to about 900 by 600. I don't know the exact resolution. To put that into perspective, my iPhone here has a 10 million dot screen. So it's still a very low resolution screen, and I actually think that's something camera makers should work on. They should make it bigger and higher resolution, because when people talk about, oh, my smartphone takes really good pictures, they're mostly saying that because they're looking at the pictures on the screen itself. Having the pictures look good on the camera is an important part of how people perceive the quality of the images, because not everybody sees them later after they've been printed or shared online. Take it from somebody who has used literally a dozen different flip screen cameras in the real world for stills photography, for candid photography, for street photography. I promise you will love it. It will not be a problem. Fuji has increased the mechanical frames per second of the X-T4 from 11 frames per second to 15 frames per second. This could improve the real-world performance. Unfortunately, we found when shooting with the X-T3 that it took so long focusing between each frame that in the real world we only ever achieved like 10 to 11 frames per second anyway, even when shooting with the electronic 30 frames per second sports mode. That mode is still the same and still requires a 1.25 times crop. That sports mode gives you blackout-free shooting and an extremely high electronic viewfinder refresh rate, making it almost as good as an SLR with just a mirror. The mechanical shutter has a top speed of 1/8,000th of a second. If you're shooting with the electronic shutter, you can shoot at 1/32,000th of a second, but there's a good chance you could experience banding with artificial lights. The X-Sync for flash is still 1/250th of a second. Fuji claims the shutter is going to be 30% quieter. 30% actually isn't as much as it sounds like, but it's going to be a little quieter, and that's a good thing. The buffer is about the same, though the specs actually decreased a little bit. It's only going to be about 60 JPEG files when shooting at 30 frames per second, or 33 uncompressed RAW files, or 35 compressed RAW files. And really, this is not enough. The buffer on the X-T3 could at times become an issue, especially if I turned off autofocus and shot at that full 30 frames per second. Even shooting JPEGs, it fills up after a couple of seconds. Now, cue all the Fuji fanboys who are going to say things like, oh, real photographers only need one frame to get it right. This is absolute nonsense to professional sports and wildlife photographers. The action often doesn't let up. You often need to shoot for several seconds at a time, and sometimes you shoot 1 second and then you rest 1 second and then the action starts right back up and you're shooting another second. If the buffer doesn't get a chance to clear between your bursts, you can still fill up that buffer, and then you see your frames per second drop down to 4 or 5 instead of 15 or 30. And that can mean that you miss the shot. A bigger buffer could really, really help. The sensor is unchanged from the X-T3, and that's disappointing to a lot of people. The sensor's not any better, but there's not some better sensor out there. It's still world class. If you're interested in what the X-Trans layout means to your images, check out my video at sdp.io/xtrans. The MSRP of the X-T4 is $1,700, which is a lot for an APS-C camera. Compare that to the full frame cameras that are available. The EOS RP, which we love, is $950. The Sony a7 III, which so many professionals have come to rely on, is going for $1,800 new, but significantly less used. The Canon R, the Z6, all of those are $1,800 very capable full frame cameras. So for Fuji to release a camera basically in that same ballpark that has a sensor that is less than half the size, that could be a real problem. Now, what does this mean to your images? Full frame cameras come with a lot of benefits. First of all, they have the same body and lens size. People talk about this all the time, about the APS-C being a significant benefit because it's smaller, but nowadays they're not smaller. The full frame cameras are the same size. The lenses are the same size when you're getting equivalent results. In fact, this Canon 70-200 f2.8 gathers twice as much light, produces more background blur than the Fuji 50-140 f2.8, and it's smaller, it's shorter. It'll fit easier in your bag. APS-C cameras also take a hit to dynamic range. Basically, there's a full stop, less dynamic range when you're shooting at the base ISO. That's pretty easy to offset. If you're shooting landscapes, you just bracket and merge the shots later. For more information, head to sdp.io/crop, where I have a couple of videos that you can watch. If you're considering switching to the Fuji system, there's something you should consider. The X-T4 is Fuji's top-end camera, but it doesn't compare against other manufacturers' top-end cameras. Fuji's X-T4 compares against everybody else's mid-range cameras. Sony has an A7R Mark IV with 60 megapixels, or they have an A9 Mark II with a real usable 20 frames per second. Nikon has a Z7 with 45 megapixels. Panasonic has the S1H with 45 megapixels. Canon has the upcoming EOS R5, which is going to blow everything away. Fuji tops out in the middle. Before you buy any Fuji camera, ask yourself two questions. Is this camera enough for me now? And is it going to be enough for me in the future? Because when people buy into a camera system, they tend to stick with it for 10, 20 years, sometimes longer. I know kids who inherited a camera from their grandparents, so they're still shooting Nikon F-mount. You're making a choice that's going to last a long time. Fuji has no plans to make the X-mount higher end. You will never be able to achieve 85mm f1.2 full-frame results like you can with the Canon EOS R mount. Fuji has no plans to release f1.8 zooms that would produce results equivalent to, say, a 70-200 f2.8 on a full-frame lens. The results you get will always be limited a little bit by this fact. Please don't get your feelings hurt by this, Fuji users. Many Fuji users produce excellent results, but buyers going into the system need to be aware of potential limitations. Let's compare the X-T4 against the X-T3, the X-H1, the Sony a7 III, the Canon EOS R, all the similar cameras. The X-T3 goes for $1,300 new or $900 used. Those are both excellent deals. And if you don't need IBIS, if you don't need the bigger battery, you might be better off spending your money on the older body. But the X-T4 adds the flippy screen, the better AF, the faster mechanical shutter, the sharper LCD. It really has no disadvantages except for being more expensive. And if you want to buy some awesome gear for Fuji or any other camera system, including drones, use the coupon code TNC20. All their used gear comes with a guarantee and a lower price, so there's just no hassle. The X-H1 is Fuji's DSLR-like camera, meant to kind of transition people from their Canon and Nikon DSLRs, and you can see it has that bigger, fatter form factor. It has the top LCD. I don't like the X-H1 as much. I don't think it feels as good. It feels kind of plasticky compared to the X-T3, which feels more metal. Even though it's durable, it doesn't feel as solid. The X-H1 is less expensive, and it has that top screen, and if you like a bigger, heavier camera, that's what it is. But the X-T4 has a more analog experience with more dials on it. It has better battery life. It shoots at 4K 60 instead of 4K 30. It has significantly better autofocus. It has a headphone jack in the body. The X-T4 has the blackout-free sports mode, and it also offers better autofocus. Even the X-T3 had better autofocus than the X-H1. Comparing the X-T4 to the Nikon Z6, you can see the sizes are pretty similar. The Nikon Z6, of course, is full frame and $100 more. The Z6 can adapt a bunch of Nikon lenses with good AF. I do put full frame Nikon lenses on my Fuji with a speed booster and I get great results, but it's really only manual focus. The X-T4 is really much more of a joy to use with the analog controls. Fuji has more mirrorless lenses than the Nikon Z system does currently, as well as the blackout free mode. The Z6 has only a single XQD card slot, whereas the X-T4 has dual SD card slots, which means if one card fails, you still have a backup and you don't lose all your pictures from the day. Compare the X-T4 to the Canon EOS R, about the same price point, has the same benefits over the Z6, like the dual card slots and better stills, autofocusing. I'm not sure which video autofocusing will be better. The EOS R has very smooth and cinematic pulls, and that's why we use it in our videos. But maybe the X-T4 will actually match it, so subscribe to see our full test. The X-T4 offers far more versatile video, shooting at 4K at 60 frames per second or 1080 at 240. The Canon EOS R is pretty limited in its video capabilities. We also determined that the Canon EOS R and RP were not suited to action or sports at all, whereas the X-T3 was excellent. Compared to the current Canon mirrorless cameras, the X-T3 and X-T4 are both better all-around shooters for people who also need to shoot sports. I would not recommend the current Canon cameras for that. But for portrait photographers, landscape photographers, you might be better off going for the full-frame Canon cameras, especially considering how excellent the high-end and expensive Canon mirrorless lenses are. Compare the X-T4 to the King, the Sony a7 III, which really changed the entire mirrorless world by pulling people into full frame at a low price point. The prices are almost identical, and in fact, the Sony a7 III sells used for significantly less than the X-T4 will be going for. and the sensor's twice as big. And the a7 III has this like amazing eye detect autofocus. Like pros rely on it all the time. Both the cameras have dual card slots, but the Sony a7 III has more mirrorless lenses and they have full frame lenses. So you could pick the 70-200 f4 and get similar results as you would to the Fuji's 50-140 f2.8 APS-C lens. Or you could upgrade to the Sony 70-200 f2.8, which is excellent, and you would get additional low light performance and additional background blur. You have the option of upgrading, something that's not currently available with autofocus in the Fuji world. The X-T4 is something that didn't exist before, therefore it is totally unfair that you would complain about it, right? You could still get an X-T3 if that's what you wanted, but we're gonna complain. First, I don't care that it has a flippy screen. I love that. That's a big plus for me, and I don't see it as being a big disadvantage. But I do care that it only has 26 megapixels. The camera still lacks a GPS, and maybe you can link it to your phone and do something like that, but we found it just hasn't worked well. GPS is extremely useful for synchronizing time on your cameras, especially when you travel, but it's also useful for remembering the locations that you've traveled to so you can return there in the future. It's also helpful for finding pictures that you took at a specific venue because you can just pull up your maps and go right to them. Fuji has a limited lens selection that cannot compare against the full frame lens selections from other manufacturers. You simply cannot achieve the same low light performance nor background blur with their current lens selection. They could offer equivalent fast lenses by offering 1.8 zooms. They have none currently. Sigma has been making them for more than a decade. I hope Fuji does this soon. When Fuji launched the X-T3, I said this is a great sports camera, but they don't have any great big primes. And now they have one. So that's good. Fuji is making progress. I would like to see them continue to build out their big prime selection for professional sports photographers who are shooting serious events because it is that good. Fuji has included no anti-theft mechanisms in this camera. Literally no manufacturer has ever included anti-theft mechanisms, but I find that when I complain about it, it happens in the next generation. So this is me doing future you a favor, add some optional features that those of us who want it could take advantage of. Similarly, there's no cloud synchronization. Only Canon is starting to offer that in their next generation cameras. I hope Fuji will be shortly behind it. If you don't like it, you don't have to use it, but I would use it. Thanks again to our sponsor, KEH. If you want to get rid of your old gear because you want to switch over to Fuji or you want to upgrade to the X-T4, sell it to KEH, no hassle. If you want the best prices on gear with guarantees, get it from KEH so you don't have to deal with scammy sellers. And I'll give you an extra 5% off with the coupon TNC20. Thank you, KEH. I'd love to hear in the comments down below what you think of the X-T4. Are you pre-ordering it? I am, right away. And I will give it to you. So be sure to subscribe so that you can see our full giveaway after the camera is launched. Thank you so much.